Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Sven Gustafsson, who has been a user of OneID in the past and also a user at ESRF and many facilities now associated with CHESS. He will be talking about dark field X-ray microscopy. So take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, June. Can everyone hear me and see my slide just fine?
Yes.
Perfect. Alrighty, well, thank you all the great talks so far. I'm excited to be here. So I'll be talking a little bit about linking the length scales, coupling the experiments to facilitate doing zoom-in studies, and I'll show you a few case studies and hopefully describe some of the what you need to do to make some of these experiments occur. So I'd like to start off by thanking all my collaborators that made this work possible. Both of these case studies I'll be showing are work that I did during my graduate studies at Purdue under Mike. And so I'd like to thank everyone here on this page here, and I shall dive right in to start off with a little bit of motivation for these zoomed-in studies, where we really want to, during material altering processes, we want to capture the microstructure and the micromechanical fields that are driving these material changes that we're observing. And some of the examples here: deformation, recrystallization, subgrain formation. We want to capture what's happening while these processes are ongoing. But unfortunately, we cannot observe the entire microstructure at all length scales during these processes. But what can we do? Well, we can carefully design experiments to facilitate zoom-in studies, interrogations of select regions of interest. And so that's what I'll show you here today, and some of the outlook afterwards. So just as a refresh, we've already looked a lot at HEDM thus far. And so I wanted to just point out a few things here. First, looking a little bit more into the far field HEDM diffraction spots themselves, we can use peak broadening techniques to learn a little bit about the relative amounts of deformation that have occurred in individual grains. And this is really useful when trying to identify critical grains of interest that you might want to zoom into with intragranular resolution. Also, I wanted to point out that I'll be talking a lot about near field HEDM as well as diffraction contrast tomography, known as DCT. And all that you really need to know is that they're equivalent techniques that can produce grain average morphologies like the one that you see in the bottom left. They just have different reconstruction algorithms. So I'll spend a little bit of extra time on dark field X-ray microscopy to make sure everyone's on the same page. This is a technique that you choose a single grain of interest in a set of lattice planes, and you put this grain, the specific set of lattice planes, in the diffraction conditions, and then you put this objective lens, a set of compound refractive lenses, in the diffracted signal, and you capture that signal on an area detector far downstream. And what this objective does is it both magnifies your intensity, so you get a nice real space image on your detector, as well as filters out non-ideal diffracted intensity. So only the bits, only the intensity that's perfectly aligned will make it onto the detector, such that we have really nice high angular and strain resolution, as you can see, as well as we get nice spatially magnified image. And so we can reach resolutions on the order of 100 nanometers, 50 nanometers to 100 nanometers in the detector plane, or the horizontal X1, X2 plane. But then the layer thickness, we have a coincident line beam that is incident upon our grain of interest, and that thickness is around 700 nanometers. And so you have a little non-symmetric voxel size if you were to reconstruct this in 3D, but you have very fine resolution in that X1, X2 direction. And then there's different types of modalities that you can scan with. You can scan with just mosaicity, where you tilt just the phi X1 and the phi X2 motors, and you can get nice intragranular resolution type information about the lattice curvature within your microstructure, and we just call those mosaicity scans. Or you can do mosaicity plus strain scans, where you also start to tilt the objective lens about 2 theta, and by tilting that lens, you can carefully select different d-spacings, and you can probe the strain components normal to the specific lattice planes that you're looking at. So we can get 2 components of orientation, 2 components of lattice curvature, and 1 component of elastic strain from a single diffraction spot of a single grain. And we can take many individual slices of this grain, many dark field scans together, and we can start to stack them in 3 dimensions and make 3D images of our grains. But I want to show a little bit what this data looks like. So on the left, I start with an intergranular misorientation that I've taken just the sum of squares of the two lattice curvature components, where you can get a relative amount of misorientation intragranular to a single grain. And then also, right, we can look at the intragranular elastic strain of that single component. Here, we're looking at LSHR, it's a nickel-based superalloy. In particular, we're looking at the 2,2-O planes, and so the strain is normal to those planes of interest. But critically, for doing these sorts of combined experiments, we really want to be careful ahead of time about knowing our experimental limitations. So currently, at least from the experiments that have done at ESRF, where this technique is currently ongoing, some things that we consider ahead of time are features like the interrogation region due to the detector is limited to about 100 microns. So knowing this, you can tailor your microstructure such that you want to make sure that your grain size is less than your region of interest or the region that you can view to make sure that you can image the entire grain at the same time. Additionally, sometimes we're flux starved. And so, right, the attenuation or the amount of flux that you have on your detector is dependent on the energy and the material. And so possible solutions that you might want to approach with are using a low X-ray attenuating material or using just small samples or extracting a region of interest that you'll see later on. And so without further too much more, we'll just jump right into one of my case studies, where first we'll look at stress and strain gradients at a twin boundary in a nickel-based superalloy. And so the motivation here, the scientific motivation, is that twin boundaries in nickel-based superalloys, they can act as sites for fatigue crack initiation. So we want to look at the intergranular metrics in these regions, the micromechanical fields there. And so we're working in LSHR. It was a disc alloy put together by NASA. And we first started at CHEST, the Cornell High Energy Synchrotron Source, where we did near field and far field HEDM, coupled with fatigue cycling to induce plasticity within our material. And then we chose a grain of interest, and we extracted that grain in the region surrounding it. We then brought it to ESRF, conducted dark field on that single grain, and afterwards we brought in a crystal plasticity model to help isolate the effect of the twin boundary itself. And so I wanted to pay particular importance to looking at this extraction process and everything that went into getting this grain of interest to at ESRF. And so first we had to choose a grain of interest. It had to be well aligned to the extraction axis such that we can then just mount it on a pedestal and put it in the goniometer at ESRF and conduct our nice tilts and actually capture our diffraction spot. We also wanted to make sure we saw some signs of plasticity in the grain, so we used that peak broadening technique that I spoke about earlier. And also we wanted something that was relatively close to the surface, yet still subsurface. And so that's what we managed to do. Critically, however, we needed to match both near field HEDM close to the surface and EBSD taken at the surface such that we could find where our subsurface grain lay in 3D space, such that we could extract it. And with a lot of help from NASA and AFRL, we were able to extract this pedestal, which contained our grain of interest that you can see there using a DCT reconstruction, right, similar to near field HEDM. And so we see that large green grain is our grain of interest. And we were then able to bring this to ESRF, where we conducted dark field X-ray microscopy on our grain of interest. And what we found was, with the DCT microstructure, it told us that we had a coherent twin, and our parent grain, was the grain of interest was our parent grain. And so we saw this coherent twin boundary that was located right above one of the combined mosaicity and elastic strain scans that we took. And so naturally, right, we want to then see what effect does the twin boundary have on the mosaicity and elastic strain seen in dark field. And so before we did that, we wanted to also bring in this crystal plasticity model to compare against our dark field to isolate the effect of that coherent twin. And so to do that, we instantiated our model twice with our near field HEDM data of the greater surrounding microstructure, both once with and then without the coherent twin present. When it was not present, we just filled it in with the grain surrounding it. And by doing that, we then can really isolate the effect of that coherent twin itself. And so here's what it looks like when we start to compare them. On the right, we have our dark field reconstruction, where you can see circled is a large gradient, spatial gradient of elastic strain about over the region of about 30 microns. We see going from dark blue up to a nice, starting to approach that hot red. And so when we compare that to our crystal plasticity model, we see that only when the twin was instantiated within our model do we see that same sort of gradient type feature. And so that's critical because this tells us right off that the gradient itself is due to the existence of the coherent twin in the microstructure to affect our parent grain in such a way. And so we also saw a feature observed in intragranular misorientation when we compared that to equivalent plastic strain. But for the sake of time, I'll save that. You can look further on a paper. But just to summarize this talk or this case study, right, we observed that coherent twin with DCT. We found that we saw these large gradients of elastic strain. With the crystal plasticity model, we were able to isolate the fact that this was caused by the existence of the twin itself. And to bring this back to our motivation from the start, right, this was in a region known to be prone to fatigue craft initiation. But critical to this talk here, right, how exactly were we able to combine HEDM and DCT to our dark field intragranular data, and what did we use that for? So critical here was, right, it provided us the surrounding context for our intragranular fields. And so we were able to identify that this gradient type feature was in a region near a coherent twin boundary, which was critical to our experiment. And then also, right, we were able to provide a spatially accurate microstructure to our crystal plasticity model to then, again, isolate the effect of the coherent twin itself. And so we'll move right on to the next case study where we learned a little bit from this experiment, and we tried to adapt a little bit to conduct another experiment with combining HEDM and dark field. And here we're working in aluminum lithium binary alloy, where we wanted to look at triple junctions. As we know, they are stress and strain concentrators. They are regions of intersection between 3 or more grains. So we wanted to explore the heterogeneous deformation at these intersections. We also, since we're looking this time at an embedded grain within our polycrystal, we wanted to look and see the impact of the elastic strain gradients in the dislocation density calculations when we're measuring these gradients from deeply embedded grains. So again, we chose a binary alloy that we specifically designed for HEDM and dark field here. We again conducted near field and far field HEDM at chest with some cyclic loading, and then we brought it to ISRF where we looked at multiple grains this time, and we were able to actually reconstruct the 3D morphology by taking many single slices of dark field of each of our grains of interest. And so again, I wanted to spend some time looking at our material selection and tailoring here. With the knowledge of our experimental limitations, right, we knew our field of view was limited, so we wanted to tailor our microstructure such that we had 50 micron diameter grains within our sample. And we also know that we wanted to be able to image relatively quickly. And so we chose a low X-ray attenuating material, and we also designed our specimen with only a 500 micron cross-section. Finally, we also wanted to load macroscopically. So we chose a HEDM RAM style sample design with this modified smaller cross-section. We arrived finally at our design and processing parameters here at the bottom, but critical here that I wanted to point out is that we really needed this EBSD verification that we see on the side here to tell us ahead of time that we really were meeting our grain expectations prior to the experiment, so we were ready to go and we were successful in our experiment. And so once we had that, we took our sample to chest, and we first started off with near field HEDM there. And while we were reconstructing that, we realized that we were missing many of our small grains in our microstructure. And so we knew that our exposure time at the time hadn't been high enough, so we missed out on some of those low intensity diffraction peaks. And so we were able to then do DCT scanning of the same region while at the ISRF. And we were able to capture those smaller grains. And so again, right, I told you before, near field HEDM and DCT can provide equivalent grain averaged information, morphological information. The only difference between these two data sets is the experimental details, the difference of the exposure and the flux here. And so with this DCT microstructure, then we're able to identify our targeted grains of interest that we did dark field X-ray microscopy on, and that's what you see here. I have each one shown with a different color. Where I'll specifically introduce grain 4 here as a grain that we're going to be looking at a little bit more in the coming slides. And in particular, note that it is embedded within our sample here. It's far from the surface. And so Once we have this match, we can do dark field on our individual grains. And as I said, we can then start to take multiple slices of each of our grains of interest, and we can stack these in 3 dimensions. And so that's what we're seeing here. On the very top row, we have our DCT reconstructions, that grain averaged information. And we've been able to spatially match it to our dark field X-ray microscopy of each of our individual grains here, where I'm showing both an intragranular misorientation map as well as a 3D kernel average misorientation to get some more local misorientation information. And so what we noted here is that we have 2 different batches of grains here. Grains 1 through 3, a little bit larger grains, they look to have a little bit higher intragranular misorientation than grains 4 through 6, which we believe is likely just due to the grains 4 through 6 having undergone full recrystallization during that annealing process. Also, I'd like to note that here we're looking at the 111 planes instead of the 220 like the previous experiments. Due to experimental differences, energies, and whatnot, we were able to look at the 111 planes, and we chose that for the relevancy to FCC deformation, as well as having that ability to capture those diffraction spots. And so now let's look a little bit more into grain 4 here. Right, with that DCT spatial matching between our grain average microstructure and our intragranular metrics from dark field, we're able to map our triple junction networks onto our individual 3D grains that we've reconstructed from dark field. And that's what you can see on the left here, where we can isolate our triple junctions from our standard grain boundaries. In the middle and on the right, we have our intragranular misorientation and our 3D cam. And I'd like to highlight that black arrow is pointing to a geometric cusp feature, as well as a region that we had a triple junction, where we do see a very high amount of intragranular misorientation in 3D cam. But since we have the ability to separate triple junctions from grain boundaries on the intragranular scale, we of course wanted to look into, well, what's the difference between the two? And so we found that high values of intragranular misorientation metrics were measured closer in general to triple junctions than standard grain boundaries. And also that triple junctions in general tended to exhibit higher intragranular misorientation, which indicates to us that, right, we had multiple grains. We now have 3 grains that all we need to satisfy compatibility between multiple deformation fields at these boundaries. And so we're seeing, as an effect of that, an increased amount of intragranular misorientation is needed. And so this is one of the big things here, is being able to map these triple junctions was a key critical component of having these coupled experiments where you have both grain average information and intragranular information from zooming in on individual grains. But also now we have this nice rich 3D data set of intragranular information, so we should approach and start to go towards spatial gradients. And so that's what I've done here. Critically, we're still in grain 4, but we're looking at just 6 single slices that you see in the upper right there in red of combined mosaicity and elastic strain scans that we took, and we're looking down on top of those perpendicularly. And I have that nice black arrow for reference to spatially locate you. But critically here, what we're seeing is when we look at the lattice curvature gradients, phi x and phi y, as well as our elastic strain of that single strain component that we're probing with dark field, we see that they're all of the relatively the same magnitude. And now, as we move further along and start to go towards a dislocation density, we can start to calculate the elastic distortion tensor as well as the Nye tensor here. And so from dark fields to a first order approximation, we can measure the three components of the elastic distortion tensor. With those 3 components, we can get 3 components of the Nye tensor, which then can be used to calculate dislocation density. And so critically, looking at the alpha 3-1 here, we see when we look at a CDF of our lattice curvature gradient and elastic strain gradient, we see that they're of similar magnitude. So right off the bat, we're seeing that elastic strain gradient are comparable to magnitude of those of lattice curvature. And finally, once we go to dislocation density, I've done an entry-wise 1 norm calculation just to get a single value of dislocation density here from our intragranular gradients. And you can see that in the left there. And I've taken a line plot across our grain of interest from one hotspot to another. Note that that hotspot D is again right there at that geometric feature that's also a triple junction. And so what I've done in the top plot, at the top line plot, is I've calculated dislocation density twice, once with the elastic strain gradient components in the calculations and once without. And when we do a % difference of those findings relative to the max dislocation density in our entire microstructure, we find that at these hotspot regions, which are going to be critical locations, right? Regions of high dislocation density are regions that might then in the future be something that we start to see damage initiation. And so at these critical locations, we see over and under estimations that can get up to about 37% relative to the max value of dislocation density. So we see right here that elastic strain gradients are really critical to capturing the dislocation density of this embedded grain within our microstructure. That's far from the surface. And so just a quick summary again, from looking at the triple junctions, by combining that DCT information to the dark field, we can see that triple junctions are behaving differently from standard grain boundaries with higher intergranular misorientation. And we also saw the importance of including elastic strain gradients in the dislocation density calculation. But critical again to this talk is that we really needed to spatially match these two techniques together to be able to embed those triple junction networks onto our grain of interest to contextualize our intragranular information. So I'll just do a quick summary and outlook here. From the case studies, we know how powerful it can be to provide context of the surrounding microstructure to our intragranular fields measured from dark field. But I also wanted to drive home the careful experimental planning is as always required. I've written out a bit of a theoretical roadmap for these sorts of experiments that can be done on the side here, where you start with a scientific question and hypothesis, you design an experiment, then you need to tailor a material with all the conditions that go along with the experiments and the current capabilities. These capabilities are always evolving. And then finally, then you can do your in situ grain average HEDM characterization, any sort of macroscopic loading, identify grains of interest, targeted zoom-in studies, and then finally your data reconstructions, spatial linking. But in the outlook here, right, next steps could be leveraging the micromechanical data from HEDM, where we bring in the grain average stresses from far field to compare to our intragranular strain that we're measuring. And then also I have a potential dream here. It's a bit of a question mark because I know capabilities are always advancing and perhaps someone's already doing this experiment, but doing in situ loading with HEDM, grain average information, and then do targeted DFXM in the same experiment where we use emerging explorations of, say, far field HEDM data, which provide the ability to identify critical grains of interest during the experiment, zoom in on that particular grain and look at things like, say, crack initiation, propagation, or dislocation structures evolving during the experiment with intragranular resolution. And so just to thank all the things that went into this, there's a lot of material and manufacturing that went in to make these samples. In both experiments as well as the synchrotron sources were critical. Of course, CHESS and the ESRF, we'd like to thank them. And then our funding sources, NSF and Sandia and DARPA. And I shall go back to the summary and outlook slide and take any questions that people might have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sven, for a very detailed experimental campaign that you undertook during your graduate school year. Very impressive. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. No questions? Oops. I have a minor question about the experiment that you ran for the near field. Was that the near field that you ran, was that a box beam near field with or was it a planar beam?
It was a box beam.
I see.
That was a box beam, and we there was a large grain size disparity, such that we had some grains were on the order of 100, 150 microns, where the smaller grains were closer to 2 to 3 microns, and so we weren't able to capture the smaller grains at all with the dynamic ranges of our detectors and the exposure times needed.
Okay. And you didn't see those smaller grains in the far field measurements either. Was that the case, or?
We did see some of them, more than in near field, but again, we didn't quite get all of the really tiny ones.
How long would the measurement take for the dark field on one of those grains?
So I believe each of those grains were mostly scanned overnight, with some additional scans in the morning time. So I'd say 12 hours per grain.
Okay. Neat. Stefan, yep.
Right. So related to June's question a little bit, the dark field imaging seem to come about from line focus slices of the grain. Is that right?
Yes.
And then there were rocking curves at every one of those line slices?
Yep.
Okay. Now, do you see any way forward, if you were to just open it up to be a huge box beam that the whole grain fits in, then the image can still be formed, right? And then you could still have access to theta or omega or whatever. Is there a way forward there to make an image, a 3D image out of like what would be, I guess, full grain illumination instead of line focus illumination using a dark field lens?
So one of the critical things here, if you were to open up the beam, you lose the ability to resolve some of your space information, because as soon as you open it up, you now have other parts of the grain might diffract and send signal to the same voxel, and so you open up non-uniqueness in your solution. And so that's what is really trying to be limited down here, that you take just a single line beam such that what we're seeing is a single projection that's flipped up onto the detector of that single slice.
Okay, yeah. So I was sort of thinking about it from the viewpoint of like what would that be called? Some sort of Fourier tomography, right? So if you didn't have a lens and you illuminated the whole grain, you'd get a diffraction pattern, and then you could survey the reciprocal space map through theta, right?
So I think
that's like a bunch of slices, yeah, that resemble that do march across a reciprocal space volume.
I think you might want to look into topo-tomography, where the lenses have been taken out, but they do look into very fine probes of reciprocal space and reconstructing the entire grain in that method.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to comment on this discussion. So it's possible to do tomography in dark field geometry, because you can do a full 360 rotation while your grain is always illuminated and the Bragg diffraction is working well. So that means you can do a tomographic reconstruction in theory. The problem is that because you have basically nanoscale resolution, that resolution will need to be maintained in the measurement geometry. That means the rotation needs to be precise on that nanoscale level, let's say 10 to 50 nanometer, whatever is your resolution in the given experiment. And that is the big challenge here. And also the whole experiment stability has to be on that level. So it's possible to do theoretically tomographic reconstruction, but no one did it yet. There are some efforts on that if based on AI or some other fiducialization technique from outside. So basically measuring the run out of the rotation, it's possible to do a software correction on the collected data and get three-dimensional reconstruction of the dark field images. It's very interesting, definitely, to go that route, but it was not done yet. So we are curious that if anyone is volunteering to do this kind of approaches.
Peter, one question. I think if you did
Sven, it was a very nice presentation. I really thank you for this nice overview.
If you do the tomography in the DFM mode with the full beam, would you have to repeat it in the two axes that the tip tilts that has been illustrated? I think it was phi 1 and phi 2 to get the orientation gradient, right? You get the shape, but you don't get the orientation gradient, right? With a single tomographic scan. Am I interpreting this correct? So in one single dark field mode, with a fixed phi1 and phi2, you do one full 360 tomography scan. You wouldn't necessarily get the orientation gradient, right? Or the strain gradient, right? So you'd have to repeat that for the combination of phi1, phi2, right?
Yes, you will have a very rich tomographic reconstruction.
Okay.
Of course, for every single polar meter, you have to do another tomoscan.
Right.
And you will get that kind of image. And you have to put together those 3D reconstructions and interpret according to your scientific question.
John?
Yes, a quick comment, because I know we're getting at time, but appreciate the talks, Sven, and looking at the theoretical roadmap. I mean, I think it's good to think in these terms a little bit in terms of users and experiment. One of the things I think that we can try to do and help users a little bit more is figure out time budgets, because there are, especially with kind of the profusion of techniques here, we'll try to stay on top of what's needed for a given, for a given measurement. And here, cleverness of sampling is going to become increasingly important, I think. So, yeah, I think it's good to think in that context a little bit, and that's something we'll try to do.
Agreed. Thank you.
Okay. So let's thank the speaker again. Sven, very nice talk, and quite heroic effort, I think. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Yanni Chen from University of Wisconsin in Madison. He's going to take a different approach, doing things very fast to look at some dynamic phenomena. So if you are there, we can see your blank screen.
Can see my slide?
Yep, very good. So take it away. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to give a presentation to talk about our research on in situ characterization of materials transformation behavior in additive manufacturing processes. So for my research, we target the really fast dynamics, so the speed is the key thing. Okay, I'll turn off my camera to save some bandwidth. Okay, so for my research, we have a large group of students and collaborators. At the Argonne National Lab, we started this with Dr. Tao Sun when he's still in the 32ID. So Dr. Tao Sun developed the initial setup for this research for the laser powder diffusion. And Andrew brought this system into 1ID and demonstrated the diffraction capability. So in 32ID, later I work with Sam, Kamel initially, it's in the project, we started together. And then Peter also made important contribution to the diffraction study. So I'll first give a brief introduction about what's our motivations. Why do we need a synchrone for additive research? Then I'll introduce the system we used to study this. Now show some results on the dynamics and the mechanism of this laser powder bed diffusion process. It's a kind of 3D printing technology. At this moment, it's the most widely used technology. At the end, I'll show you to learn from the synchrone experiment. Based on the insights, so we can develop some strategy to mitigate the defects or even eliminate defects. So finally, give a summary. So I'll talk about our research on started the laser powder bed diffusion process. The laser powder bed diffusion is a process we print apart with complex geometry. it's a great advantage. So this one example, the fuel nozzle printed by GE can print a really delicate the liquid channel for the fuel to flow through. But for this technology, we do have some challenge. It's about the quality. So this video shows the printing process. We spread a layer of powder, then the laser start to melt the area we want to form a part. From this video, you can see the laser moves pretty fast. And we see the spark come out. So in this process, it's a very localized laser material interaction to form a very tiny model pool. Then in this process, there's a possibility for defect formation. So almost we connect the liquid pool in very, very tiny ones, millions of pools connect together to form part. At the time I started my research around 2015, so we don't know much about this really laser material interaction dynamics. We don't know, so what happens there? And so what's the mechanism for the defect formation? Now to start this process also very challenging because the laser moves fast. It's about 1 meter per second and really localized in 100 micrometer space. The matter is not transparent. It's hard to use the visible light camera to see through the environment pretty harsh. Then we start to work with argon and to see this process. Through about 7 years research, then we find out pretty much understand the whole process. So my group, we focus on really to quantitatively understand the dynamics and the mechanism of this process. So this schematic shows all the key mechanism of process in this process. So first we start from powder, this metal powder. We use a wiper or called a recoater and to spread a thin layer of powder. When we have this layer of powder, we turn on the laser beam. So the laser beam will heat up the material. Now this heating is pretty interesting. The laser interact with this metal only about the top 10 nanometer absorb laser energy. So this means the heating is really localized. So this localized heating will cause the liquid to gas transformation. So there's boiling. And this metal vapor can move really fast because of the localized heating. So the vapor move really fast, will push the powder away. We call it spatter. Then this this gas flow will drill a hole in the model pool. We call it vapor cavity or K-hole or depression zone because the vapor moves so fast, about 1,000 meters per second, the recoil pressure will push the liquid down to form this hole. Now this absorption, not uniform, this hole will fluctuate. Later I'll show you the video significantly, and will trap the bubble inside. So they cause the bubble movement. And this liquid, when it cools down at a high speed, then we get the solidified part. Then this solidification process also very complex because the cooling rate normally in the million count per second is really fast. So the solidification can be far from equilibrium. So we have interest to understand so what's the solidification behavior. So this from the powder spreading to this laser material interaction, we form the spatter, we form the model pool, we have the porosity and the solidification. So we cover all the whole process, try to understand so what's the defect formation mechanism, what's the phase transformation mechanism, so how can we make the process defect free. So this is the system. We use this schematic view. This shows what we run in the 32ID to make a very tiny powder bag. This length around 0.5 to 1 millimeter. We put a powder, we turn on the laser runs about 1 meter per second most time. X-ray penetrates through the whole thing. We have the image detector, we can see the morphology change. At the same time, we can do the diffraction, but most time we do separately. So these are the 32ID. Because the vapor gas that causes the liquid gas interface move really fast, we need a high frame rate. The highest frame rate is about 6.5 megahertz. So most time, so 1 megahertz is enough for most phenomena. So this is the setup. We have the X-ray come in, go through this chamber, have the diffraction, have the imaging. And for imaging, we can see really fast phenomena morphology change. And for diffraction, you can see the atomic scale information, but at a theoretical idea how the diffraction can be fast, we can only capture a quarter of the ray. And also it's a pink beam. And to do quantitative analysis, go to the 1ID. So this provides the best X-ray source for us to study the transformation behavior of the material. This time we just get a piezo bare substrate, thin plate, then you laser to melt it, create a melt pool to simulate the real AM condition. We also did powder bed. We didn't find really much difference compared with the powder bed and this just bare substrate. I think the reason because we want to see the solid liquid transformation behavior. Liquid solid transformation is far below the surface. The powder on the surface has less impact. So this shows why